Hello and welcome to the next episode of mindmastery channel. Today I wanted to continue with the subject of schizoid personality disorder, as I think that there is a lot of things to explore, a lot of things that could help people to understand themselves better in order to, lead a functional life, if you like. I think the most important subject that we could talk about in regards to this personality type is this idea of the authentic or the true self. I was initially meant to talk about the false self, but then I've realized that I've actually covered this subject in the previous video on the defense mechanisms and the wall that someone with schizoid builds around themselves in order to protect this authentic self. So I'm not going to go too much into detail about the false self, but rather I think it would be much more beneficial to focus on this authentic or the true self, which could help us to, raise this self-understanding and increase our self-awareness and perhaps increase the quality of our functioning so that we don't go in too much into this distressing states, or we stop going into this distressing states once and for all. It depends on a person and how far you are into this recovery. So the subject of the true self is a little bit complex because generally we have this idea that you have one true self, right? There is this core self at the bottom of your personality, which defines who you are, which, defines your values, your orientation in life, your goals, and so on and forth. However, for someone with schizoid personality, there isn't just one true self, and that's the whole complexity. Now, the theory that I'm going to describe has been inspired by a website called Exile. I'm not sure if it's still working because I've checked a few hours ago and it was still under maintenance, but I'm going to provide the link to it under the description anyway. And this website has been developed by people suffering from schizoid personality disorder for people suffering from schizoid personality disorder. So it's all based on experience rather than, clinical observation or clinical practice, nothing like that. There might be some things from, general psychology, but it's mostly based on the experience itself, which is probably the most valuable thing if you want to understand yourself better. Now, because we know that one of the primary mechanisms operating in the schizoid personality is that of dissociation, and also that there are certain splits or schisms inside the mind, we can say that this dissociating mechanism is the primary cause why there are parts of the personality, why the personality is split into these 4 different parts. Now, to be clear, the split of this personality is not the same like in multiple personality disorder, or not even the same like in schizophrenia, because in multiple personality disorder, there are blackouts, there is amnesia, like, you don't have any coherent sense of self at all. You suddenly go unconscious and there is different personality emerges, and so on and forth. And in schizophrenia, the personality itself might be intact, but the conscious mind, the whole mind actually is so split that different parts begin to live on their own. They have their own function and they are very autonomous, so that, the patient doesn't have any control over, which part emerges and which part is more conscious, which has more power than they do. So again, these 2 conditions are very different to schizoid personality. But some people say that, someone with this personality might have certain predispositions to developing schizophrenia. But again, schizophrenia is something different. It's a serious illness. It's not a personality disorder. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe each of these 4 parts that could be considered as a part of as forming the whole gestalt of the true self. And later on, I'm going to discuss the implication of this knowledge and how we can perhaps integrate these parts a little bit better so that we can function properly. So I'm going to start with a part called the Exile, which probably is the most pronounced part in someone with this personality type. I mean, who am I to judge? Perhaps someone else values the different part of themselves more. So the exile is this total retreat into yourself. So it's feeling independent, self-reliant, completely isolated from other people. At the same time, perhaps feeling connected with the universe, but not people. People are not good enough in that case. It's this experience of, drifting into the space of lacking any connection with the society, perhaps. And, many people can get very creative in this state because you can avoid distractions very easily. And also because you keep this very distant perspective on life and other people and yourself, perhaps, you can get very unusual ideas, very creative ideas. So when you're in this state, you might acknowledge that you are quite lonely. Eventually, you're going to come to this realization sooner or later. But in the initial stages, you will be quite happy, and because you are on your own. Perhaps you're feeling refreshed. Perhaps you're feeling like you are safe because you are so deep within yourself that there's no threats to your identity, to your time, to your energy, and so on and forth. I probably shouldn't judge like this, but I think that it's the schizoid at their best because they can avoid trouble in this state. They can avoid, the distressing situations that come from interacting with the world. But it's just my very subjective judgment. But regardless, I think it's the most positive state where there is least distress and you can be the most productive and, engage with your project, with creativity, and, whatever you like to do. Now, if we look at the other quadrants, they are not as positive, in my opinion at least, because they arise in situations when you are placed in a position of being forced in a way to interact with the world. So if we start from the betrayer, in my opinion, the betrayer is the most destructive state because you are not only wounding other people, but you are also wounding yourself. Eventually, you're going to come to a realization that you've done something, really terrible. And you might also realize that, whatever you've done has been quite destructive. So the betrayal comes up when you really get overwhelmed with the outside world, when you really get overwhelmed in the relationship, when you get overwhelmed by your job or by whatever circumstances you are in. So it's a state just before going into this exile, if you like. When you're in this state, or in this mode, if you like, you might be quite nasty towards other people. You might not be very polite. You might be even abusive. You might, express your anger in inappropriate ways because you feel so overwhelmed or so cheated or so betrayed by other people that your empathy goes out of the window. Your principles and values might not have any value for you anymore. So this state is, it's quite destructive in my opinion because you might destroy your relationships, you might destroy your position at work, you might ruin whatever you've been creating before, and then you have to start all over again. So again, the betrayer arises in circumstances when you feel disappointed in others, when you feel overwhelmed, when you feel cheated or misunderstood or exposed even, depending on circumstances. So the primary emotion associated with this state would be anger or frustration. Since schizoids don't really have good means of exploring and expressing their anger, they might go into these extremes of, taking this anger onto other people in order to, discharge this whole energy. If we look at the left side of the whole picture of all these quadrants, we can see interesting dynamic here because we can see the master and the slave. And these two parts are, very related to each other. Just like the right half of the picture the betrayer and the exile are very related, because when you go into the betrayal, eventually you're going to go to exile because you get so overwhelmed, or you're going to get so embarrassed of what you've said or what you've done. But generally, these two dynamics will occur together in one way or another. The similar dynamics occur on this left half of the picture with the master and the slave. So if we look at the master, when you're in this state, when you're in the state of the master, you might feel like you're having everything under your control. So you have your shit together. You might have a, perfect schedule. You might feel like, all other people around you, they're not doing enough. They're not good enough. So perhaps they deserve to be punished or criticized. People are stupid, and so on and forth. So you might feel like you are, at the top peak of your energy levels, if you like. This might be also experienced as perhaps being like a villain behind the curtain, so that you're like a puppet master. More often than not, you are not, but it's like a fantasy that we cultivate in order to deal with being in the other quadrant called the slave, which I'm going to go to in a minute. But basically, being the master, being in this mode of the master, is about having a control, having this perhaps even narcissistic inflation that we are better than other people. We don't need other people. And if we engage with other people, they should comply because we know better. Or perhaps there might be like a feeling of, how to put it, experiencing the archetype of the Joker, so that, they will never find out who I am. They will never find out why I'm doing certain things. You might, play tricks on other people. It really depends on the person, but most importantly, this part of the schizoid mind is about, exercising control. So I would imagine that this part of the personality is quite important to the maintenance of your self-esteem, because you don't feel dependent on other people. You feel like you can control yourself. You are independent. You're self-reliant. And perhaps even for some people with schizoid personality, being in this mode of the master might equal like wearing this mask that you are invulnerable, that, nothing can really touch you because you have this control over yourself and your emotions, and perhaps other people around you as well. Now, the last part that I wanted to discuss is the slave. And technically, the slave, this mode of being, is in a direct opposition of the master, right? So when you're in this mode of the slave, you feel like you own something to other people. You need to please other people. You feel like you have to prove yourself to other people. Perhaps that you need to explain yourself. Perhaps you might feel a little bit like a child that needs some guidance, and your self-esteem might be quite low at this point. So for some people, going into this mode of the slave usually arises in intimate relationships. For instance, you might have like tendencies for codependency, so that, you sacrifice yourself for the other person in order to, please them in some way, or in order to hope that one day they're going to understand you properly, that you don't have to feel alone anymore, and so on and forth. So obviously, when you're being in the slave mode for a while, you eventually going to realize that you're being exploited, right? And you are a sucker for trying to please so many people around you, that it's simply unfair that you've been given in to the relationships, to friendships, to, family members, and so on and so forth, that you've been giving so much energy and time, but you've been not getting anything in return. So natural progression from this state would be going into the betrayal, right? Where you feel, okay, that's enough. I'm not doing that anymore. I feel overwhelmed, or I feel like I don't have any more energy, and so on and forth. And I forgot to mention, to go from the master to the slave, you're gonna eventually realize that being in in this position of the master, perhaps it's wrong. Perhaps you might feel like you demand too much of other people. Perhaps you feel like you shouldn't take so much time of other people. Or you simply start doubting yourself, doubting your actions, doubting your self-esteem, that eventually you are bound to end up in this position of the slave. Now that's in very simplified terms, because often that the whole process is not very sequential or linear. So you might go from the betrayal to the slave or to the master and so on and forth. Or perhaps within 10 minutes, you might feel like there are influences from each of these different personality parts of you. Now, at this point, it would be worth to ask, what do we do about it, right? Because most of the schizoid problems are the result of these different parts being in conflict with each other. So, for example, you might think one thing when you are being in the master mode, but then you'll realize that you want something different when you are in the exile mode. So all these different conflicts will, they can be quite distressing. They might be quite confusing. You might end up in a place where you don't know what you want, you don't know what you need, because there's so many conflicts between these different parts of your personality. So obviously the first step would be increasing your awareness and understanding of how you function, how these different influences or forces within you influence you on a daily basis, right? Perhaps you might want to keep a diary as to when specific mode or specific part of you arises. When does it take control, or when does it influence you the most? So that would be the first step of increasing your understanding. Now, some people might say that they don't like a specific part of them. For example, that they might judge the betrayal as being very bad, right? It's very destructive. It might be very destructive. So why not just get rid of it? Well, that's not the very good approach, in my opinion, because all these 4 parts, they are you. They are the true self. So you need each of them. You need the betrayer in order to tell you when you had enough, right? When you feel stressed out, when you feel overwhelmed, when you need to step back and recharge your batteries. You need the master part because it will help you to, feel energized, feel like you're motivated to do something, and give you this sense of, at least some sense of control over your life, where you can feel like, you can achieve something, and it might be quite motivating for some people. And you also need the slave part in order to balance the master part, so that you know when to remain a bit passive, when to wait for a while, or for example, how to be compassionate towards other people, how to offer or how to give something to others. So each of these parts is very helpful. And obviously you need the exile, right? Because if you want to be creative, if you want to have all these ideas, and if you want to keep these unique perspectives that you are having, then obviously keeping the exile that will provide you with comfort and soothe you in difficult times can be very useful, obviously. So in my opinion, if you want to function to the best of your ability, you might want to integrate each of this part into your conscious awareness, into your ego, if you like. So instead of going into extremes, into each of this quadrant, this part, you might want to learn how to stay precisely in the middle of the spectrum, so that you can have a perspective from the betrayal, you can have the perspective from the exile, and from the master and the slave, right? So you can look at different issues from these different perspectives. And also, that could help you to increase awareness as to how to respond in specific situation, what would be the best response, what would be the healthiest response for you. And also that could help you to increase your ability to cope with different situations, cope with stress, cope with different emotions that each such situation provides. So if you combine it with an awareness of different defense mechanisms, with this awareness of different parts and different forces within you, then you can find out how to avoid going into extremes and create further schisms in your personality, further splits, further dissociations. So in very short, if I had to summarize the true self or the authentic self of someone with schizoid personality, it's not just one true self, but the whole self is actually split and fragmented into at least 4 major parts, which influence our behaviors, influence our emotions, and provide us with different coping strategies to deal with life and different circumstances that we find ourselves in. So I hope you found it helpful. As usual, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them just below the video, and I'll see you the next time. Thank you very much for watching.